And a very interesting one, we like to actually talk about this one because Christian apologists use it all the time about God created you from a fluid emanating from between the backbone and the ribs, which of course poses the question, who would actually even say that? But I'll let Kash actually explain that, and I will highlight a couple of things here.
So this verse is brought up in conversations between Christians and Muslims a lot in the context of scientific inaccuracies, right? So Christians will bring it up and say, look at your book. It says that humans were created from a gushing liquid that comes out from between the backbone and the ribs. And it's like, oh, ha ha ha, you're a Muhammad guy. You didn't realize where babies come from, right? So this is the context and usually how this is discussed, this verse. Uh, the thing is, like, what comes to mind to me is, are you really trying to tell me that a text from the 7th century was able to amass an empire around it and form a religious identity around it? And that text in question says silly things like this. Sort of like, no, that's not quite right. It doesn't quite fit, right? So my intuition is, okay, therefore, because of what happened in history with the text, it must have at least been decent literature, right? So when I come across a verse which seems silly, my ethos is it silly or is it Semitic in the sense of it being a cross-Semitic uh, verse? So when it comes to this context, we see this. These are the two verses, 6 and 7, in Surah 86, where we read, "He was created," in context. It's referring to mankind as such, as a collective whole, was created from fluid ejected, emerging from between the backbone and the ribs. Right. So that's the sin reading of this. The first word I want to focus on is the word the backbone. Okay. What you see there in the screenshots is from corpus.quran.com, where you can see the congruence of a root. So here is the congruence of the root sade lam ba, salab. And I'm pronouncing that terribly, probably. And this root we see in all contexts it's used in, except for two. It consistently refers to crucifixion as such, right? So they be crucified, I will surely crucify you, and so forth. So it's interesting how the root refers to crucifixion in all contexts, except when it's the bare root form. When you simply have the base three consonant root with a definite article, which we see then in the bottom right here, that should intuitively translate to the crucifixion, or rather the cross, right? But no, instead we get this sense of the bare bone root form with a definite article of this root is actually backbone all of a sudden. So for a first step, let's just say for the time being that this refers not to the backbone, but it refers to the crucifixion or the cross. Okay, so then we have this question, okay, created from a liquid emerging between the backbone and, which is now the cross, and the ribs. Well, let's look at the word ribs as well. The word ribs is tu ra b. I forget the last two consonants, but you have two peaks at the end, and it's tu ra b, and then you have another. There's also an alif gets inserted, if I recall correctly, and there's a hamza. Funny business, if I recall correctly. I might be wrong about that. Anyway, point being is that this root that it's using, tu ra b n or tu ra b, and there's some question in early manuscripts of what's happening. There are one or two peaks. Putting that aside for now, the root trb is a crucial Old Testament theological term. It doesn't use the root trb in the Old Testament Hebrew. It uses a different root. But in the Aramaic Targumic transmission, the root used for the sacrificial fat of the sacrificial system in the Old Testament is this root trb, and it refers literally to fat. And the idea here in the Old Testament was that the fat around the organs of the animal was to be made exclusively for Yahweh. So it was Yahweh's portion, and no one could touch it, and it was sufficient for Yahweh, is the idea. So they would burn that, and it would release a fragrance that would please the Lord. So, my son in whom I'm well pleased, yada yada. And what it seems to be doing here actually is it's painting this image using Old Testament ritualistic theology to map the ultimate sacrifice on the cross to the altar terminology, where it would appear that the fat is being associated with the body of Jesus, And then the cross, the bare root salad, would then render the verse that he was created from a fluid ejected, emerging from between the cross and the fat, the sacrificial fat that's exclusive for Yahweh. And what would be coming out as a gushing liquid from between the cross and Christ's body, that would be his blood. So then it becomes, okay, so we were created from Christ's blood. That sounds kind of right, but it's a little bit off. Like in New Testament theology, we are a new creation in Christ, but that's not the same as being created from his blood. So there seems to be one final piece of the puzzle missing, which is this root, which we see as of chalaka, which they say means to create. The thing is, there's so many different words in the Quran for create, but this one also means create. So I looked at the Rasim, and I said, okay, so the khalapa or khalafa, right? This form matches also with the heth instead of the kha as the first. Long story short, this root refers to substitution. It also in Aramaic more foundationally means to pass over judgment. So if we read it in that line, as a final step, it reads something like, he, mankind, was substituted from a liquid ejected, emerging from between the cross and the sacrificial fat. Redemption through the blood of Jesus. So either one, we're reading a verse about some Bedouin who didn't know where babies came from, or two, we happen to read it in the lens of the Syro-Aramaic, and it happens to be a beautiful image of the passion and the ransom of many by the blood of one. So that's this one example of this verse where you just pick a verse that sounds silly, you try and read it in accordance with this methodology, and you see something very Christological underneath.
I think this is very compelling. Like independently of what you found, I was looking at a coin by Abdul Malik, and I worked out that actually it's indicating the nails on the cross. There's four, what's referred to as pellets. I'm trying to remember what the name of the coin was. Doesn't come to me, but there's actually a part in the center of the coin with the spear with that would have pierced the side of Christ with the blood coming out. So this the significance of Jesus' side being pierced with a spear was significant for Christians in the 7th century. And what adds to the case as well is that Christians believed that they had the actual lance. Now, this may not have been the case, but that they had the lance from the crucifixion in Jerusalem in the 7th century. So I think all of this fits in with that very much so. It would have been very relevant for Christians at that time.
In fact, there's one little interesting side topic I can mention here, which is something I found particularly fascinating when looking at the hadiths, in the sense that there is a hadith, which I was watching a God Logic live stream, where they were debating on whether the hadith, which refers to someone saying, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. And then God Logic is suggesting, look, this hadith is saying that Jesus is on the cross because these words come out of his mouth when he's on the cross. And the Muslim comes back and says, no, I have this other hadith where it says that he wiped his forehead. And the argument being put forward was, this can't be about Jesus, because if he was on the cross, crucified in a T-pose, how could he possibly wipe his forehead? And this is the level to which the discussion has devolved to. That we're using this verse about him wiping his forehead to suggest, and here it gets better, because the word for wipe, translated as wipe, is the word for anoint. So wait, and it doesn't say that he wipes his forehead. It says he wipes the blood from his forehead. So therefore it would be he anoints the blood from his forehead. But better yet, the word that supposedly means forehead, I look at what that word means in Aramaic, and it means his side. So to what you're saying about the piercing of the side, right? If that hadith, even the hadith, which comes later, potentially is pointing to Christology. And then the word for anoint is then replaced by wipe. It becomes this totally silly story that doesn't really mean anything. And then gets brought up in debates about, it can't be Jesus, because how could you wipe your forehead when you're crucified, right? So and yeah, so that's fascinating. So then maybe the hadith traditions are still attesting in large part a Christological understanding, right? Which I found fascinating because I always assumed that the hadiths were, that was past the language change. So this blew it all wide open.
Yeah.
Well,
I'd say this Christology survived in the Christian communities beyond long into the period when hadiths were being written, so it's not surprising that it's creeping in.
Right.
if
Yeah,
I could
and there are-
disagree with you, Cash,
Mm-hmm.
I read it a little different, and also keeping Aramaic in the mix. When it says he was created from a fluid, this word khalaqa is actually the Aramaic halaqa, which means shave. This is the literal meaning, and it means also divide. So the Quran, it doesn't say create from scratch. It says divide stuff that's already there so that you start the creation. So
Oh,
he
you're
was
going with
divided. Yeah.
right, this portion root. I found that as well. So you could find either it seems to refer to like sort of like a predestining sense, like you were portioned from the liquid, right? Like you were given
Yes.
predestiny in a sense, right? That was another one of the senses. So what I'm referring to is rasam ambiguity, in the sense that yes, the form that we're looking at straight up would point to that sense. However, because of the ambiguity of the KHA and the hef, therefore it's entirely feasible that we can go with that route too. And because of the context, my inclination is that the route we're looking for is Passover, substitution terminology, and therefore it doesn't seem coincidental that the Rossum can attest that one.
It might be, but what I'm saying I think is easier to digest. And if I may continue, it says emerging from between. So here, solb, I have it as solid because that's what it literally means. And then this word tara'ib, it means fatty, something that's fat. And here it says, in my opinion, between the bones and the intestines of the human, because these are fatty parts. So you have the solid parts and the fatty parts. So it's just the fluid that is gushed out between the entirety of your bones and the intestines, which are the fatty parts. But this is just, how I see it. Maybe I'm wrong. This is how I see it for now. You see?
Mm-hmm. Well, what I would say to that is like when you say literally it means solidness, I would say source, sir, right? Because the root is extremely explicit in all of its attestation in terms of the Aramaic
No,
and
I
Syriac
will
I'm
tell
looking
you. I
up.
will tell you. Try and make all the variations. Let's say
Mm-hmm.
صلب, صلبة, تصلب. Let's say you have a hardening in your arteries. In the Arabic, you will say تصلب شرايين. So something, it turns from liquid to solid. So that's why I think when it talks about Jesus being crucified, I do not see cross. I see impaling or affixing. This is the most literal, because this is how you could apply it in every context in the Quran. This is more literal than cross. Cross came later. People later connected these words with cross as salib. Of course, today salib means cross. You see?
You're right. Well,
Yeah.
we'll discuss that more. Yeah, we'll discuss that more.
Yeah.
That's one thing that I always find very interesting about this verse is that even now in the 21st century, you still see many Muslims trying to actually get this explained away, and they try to say, "Oh no, well," and it's like, okay, hey, hang on a minute. There must be an error here. There has to be like some form of problem. It cannot be certainly understood in the way that they normally translate it, which is what we have on the screen, because people knew how babies were made, and I haven't checked, but I suppose that's actually very ancient, and people knew that even from before the Paleolithic period, but also who would actually follow someone into battle, which is, imagine this story. So we have Muhammad walking around in Mecca, and he's not very successful for the first 10 years when he's just preaching. And then when he says, okay, fine, we're going to start assaulting caravans. And it's like, yeah, nobody would follow the guy who said you're created from something like this. It wouldn't actually make sense. And also in a theological book, having that, it just sticks out like a sore thumb. So I wrote there, so would it be possible that that the original meaning was actually hidden for obvious reasons? They knew where it was, but they had to change something, maybe in the rasam, or maybe they couldn't read it. By the time that they get to add diacritics and stuff, they are facing a verse and they just can't make any sense of it, and they have to actually change something. So this is something that we need to look at some of the older manuscripts that are available and see if we spot any foul play, because it just feels very weird that this would make it into the Quran and people would just follow that guy into battle, which we know he wasn't there. And actually that is what is going to happen immediately in the very next slide. So now the
JC,
what happened
before we move on, can you just pull up the capture.png, the image that I attached, just real quick, so we can see what I was referring to in terms of the Aramaic here. So to be fair, I mean, I know that this is Christian Palestinian Aramaic. I don't know necessarily when this particular source where we get this attestation of the cross was written. So it may be later Syriac or something like this, but it seems to me that well attested early on, we have this in the Aramaic. And then the second image, JC, to just quickly flash to find the attestation of that form to crucify also then in the Syriac as well.
Okay, great. So we'll explore more some other time, Cash, not during a live session. So, okay, let's go.
I'm curious if there's an echo of all of this in the famous story of Muhammad's death, where it says, "I feel as if my aorta is being cut." It's just a thought I had there.
Think about, yeah.
Okay, actually, we haven't actually explored those verses, which I think actually probably I should do those next, because they are interesting. They're supposed to be about Muhammad, and we know that Muhammad is not in the book. So who is it talking about exactly? So actually, good shout. That will be probably next on the list.